Nice to meet you all. I'm Rajat, and I'm a product manager at ServiceNow. And today's presentation will be about going beyond benchmarks and rethinking how we evaluate LLMs in high-stakes environments. So give me just a second to set up my screen here. Okay, hopefully that shows up for you all. All right. So, you must have heard about evaluations a little bit, and today's presentation will talk about how do we go beyond some of these benchmarks that we hear about when we talk about LLMs, and think about how in industry specific environments or high stakes environments, how do we properly evaluate LLMs and the outputs that they're giving us, and how do we move beyond some of these generic metrics like accuracy, precision, or recall to more contextually defined excellence metrics? And that's where evals come in. So move to the next slide. So like I said, LLMs are beginning to enter critical workflows, and they're beginning to assist professionals already in many different fields. And the fact of the matter is that if we want all of these implementations to be successful, we're hoping that the people that are using these LLMs will use them, will use the output. And what's beginning to happen is they're part of real workflows now, which have consequences, right? They're starting to influence decisions. And the evaluation standards sort of haven't kept pace with the real world deployment. I mean, beyond just thinking about, is this response good enough? I think a lot more thought has to go into how do we evaluate the output of these LLMs. So today's session is really going to talk about that, defining sort of this problem that is faced by all of us across the different industries that we work in. What are the core challenges within it? Because we need to understand the problem before we can solve it. And I'll share with you again a way to create a holistic evaluations framework. This will look different depending on the industry or even the company that you work at, or for that matter, even the department you work within or what role you're in. And we'll touch a little bit upon targeted quality tuning. And obviously, given the amount of time we have, I'm not going to get into how you can write effective evals, but happy to chat about that later as well. So you might have heard about some of these metrics like BLEU or F1 score, which is really a balance of precision and recall. And coming from the machine learning side of the house, we were all trained to orient ourselves around accuracy, precision, and recall. These are easier to compute, but they don't really capture the nuances of text-based interactions that these LLMs are having, or for that matter, there's so many things going on within any block of text or any prompt that you feed into an LLM. There's intent behind it. You're looking for certain information, you're looking for help with a certain topic, and there's also lots of sentiment within that message that you're sending. So, these metrics, they don't quite capture all of the things that we do want to measure, such as quality or safety or the tone, or maybe the adherence to the brand of your company or your bot, whatever you're trying to create. And so high scores there won't necessarily mean that your AI implementation is successful, right? And people have been talking about that sort of valley of discontentment. And this is sort of how we go beyond it. So what are we really trying to measure when we're working with LLMs, or we're looking at an agentic workflow for that matter? We're trying to assess how well the LLM output is meeting the needs for that context. And so, like I just mentioned, trust, reliability, actionability, depending on the context, there might be different ways that you define quality for the output. And an evaluation at its simplest should answer, would a domain expert trust and use this output? That's a high bar, but it's a good one to try and aim for as a North Star. So, if is the user getting what they need? Is the task that the user wanted to get done actually getting done? So what are the dimensions of an LLM-based workflow or an agentic workflow's quality? Factual accuracy, reasoning and depth. Again, just by virtue of using a reasoning model, does that mean it's reasoning well, or is it contextually dependent? The coherence of the output, is the output safe, and given sort of a medical scenario, is it leading to harm avoidance? And then, of course, depending on your company or geographical context, you might want to take into account ethical and cultural alignment as well. So when we think about the challenges that we are faced with regards to tuning quality, um, these are sort of the three issues we face broadly. Is there's a subjectivity, meaning to say that, similar to how you might go and talk to one customer support rep versus another, the you might be pleased, but the interaction might look very different in both cases. So multiple answers can be valid, right? And if it is an open-ended task, particularly like, for instance, with the 4.0 image generation model, you're going to get multiple valid responses based on your prompt. So you could have a lot of different outputs that are correct. um, Subjectivity is an important one here. Ground truth, which is just a fancy word for what counts as a correct answer, or how a domain expert would evaluate the output, that's fuzzy again. So there's no clear gold standard, right? Reference answers could be incomplete, they could be biased, and so we need an evaluation that can account for all of those scenarios. And of course, there's context dependence, which, context is king, and the right answer wouldn't just leverage the content that the person is perhaps providing in the prompt, but it would also leverage the context of the task. What is this person here to do? And again, this is where evaluations and sort of that manual labeling that we might do even with ML data, right, comes into play. And again, like, the correctness will also vary based on your persona even. It's not just a function of, what is the task that we're seeking to get done. And the other thing is, you have different thresholds for how many times you can get an answer potentially inaccurate, or give a wrong answer. So for instance, if you are working with an LLM inside of a company that is just looking for information, perhaps you could still, again, ideally you wouldn't provide incorrect information, but even if you point to a dated web page, that's still okay. But if it is an LLM enabled workflow for a nurse in a clinical setting, then you want to make sure that the responses are accurate, and your thresholds will be much tighter, um, depending on that. So that's just an example of how the context dependence as well as the thresholds really keep changing. So we're working with a lot of challenges, but nothing is new here in the sense of how we humans interact with each other to begin with, right? So just diving deeper into some real world examples of what are these high stakes situations. So I briefly mentioned these, right? But you might remember, there was an article that got popular around how a lawyer had prepared a petition using ChatGPT, and it tended to allude to court filings that maybe didn't exist. And again, we want to avoid those scenarios, and companies are building specifically for those workflows. So obviously they're thinking these things through, but um, depending on your product or use case, you would that is a high stakes situation. Similar example, obviously, in the medical example that I just shared too, is if a chatbot misinterprets your symptoms, and for whatever reason we enter this world where, I don't know, you're interacting with Kaiser, in the United States, and your symptoms are misinterpreted. and you're not recommended to go get a certain blood test done, then you've potentially missed catching something early on, and that's a big issue. So accuracy, again, even I tend to reference more traditional metrics, but the LLM response needs to be safe, and it needs to also admit when it may not know the answer and redirect to a nurse, for instance, or redirect to a doctor, depending on the severity of of the conversation or the issue that's being discussed. And again, in an HR example, you can imagine this already. This is already in play with ATS and whatnot, but you might unintentionally filter out qualified candidates just by virtue of not having taken into account how that screening process works and how you might have done that, or how a subject matter expert might have done that as a human. So you need to think about domain specific risk levels, how experts would perceive things, and what the criticality of accuracy is. Accuracy here not referring to the technical calculation, but more just a general accuracy. So now let's talk about how we can get towards more tailored, holistic evaluation frameworks. So obviously we've talked about how one size fits all metrics will fail across domains, and we need unique evaluation criteria based on the industry. For instance, within an enterprise context, or a SaaS context, software as a service context, we might want the support-based chatbots to have a certain tone. Like they should be eager to help, and they should perhaps you decide that they should come across confident, but not arrogant. And those are all things that you might want to set up evaluations for. And then the framework must dynamically balance trade-offs as well. You're not going to get a sort of perfect response on all dimensions, right? So you're going to have to pick which particular dimension you want to attach more weightage to, depending on, again, the industry or the context. And you also have to continuously incorporate domain experts' input, um, so that you can accurately define success. And there are frameworks out there. I do want to take a second to talk about this. Um, Frameworks like Helm, which is the holistic evaluation of language models, and there's an evaluation harness framework as well. These are good starting points because they're already taking into account a bunch of things. Like Helm looks at fairness or bias, accuracy, and the evaluation harness framework, it helps you automate evals that can help detect how your LLM-based workflow is performing across standardized benchmarks. But it behooves us to go beyond that and think about, what are the different kinds of tasks that our specific um, LLM-based workflow or our chatbot is going to do. So I talked about judgment, and again, reasoning models, they're also known to be better just simply because they can, or agentic workflows, when we talk about them, we think about where judgment could be handed off to the LLM. And then on our side, meaning when we are designing these workflows, we need to think about what are the judgments we need to make within the evaluations, because we'll be sort of providing the ground truth in a sense. We'll be looking at lots of chat transcripts and labeling them as, this is safe, this one was potentially unsafe. And so we will be exercising judgment. So going beyond that sort of true or false or yes or no kind of evals to more of a like a Likert scale, right? As we have in surveys, going from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, or providing categories like safe, neutral, unsafe, friendly, not friendly, and again, neutral. These are the ways that we'll have to think when we are thinking about labeling some of the conversations and defining that ground truth uh, in order to make our LLM-based workflow more performant or our agentic workflow more performant. And think about the edge cases too, right? Like, how can you model uncertainty, and how might an expert tackle that, right? Again, and this is where you get to be a little creative, and you get to think about, this is an explicitly good scenario, but for whatever reason, if somebody types into the chat that, I something toxic perhaps, then you need to have a response for that kind of scenario as well. And of course, you want to hew as closely as you can to real world decision making context. And it's sometimes it's okay for the LLM to say, like, I don't I don't have the full knowledge on this, but I will redirect you to someone that knows about this better. Um, and Obviously, one other reason to set up these judgment-based evals is you could do an A/B test between different large language models as well. Like, you might decide that the Claude 3.7 Sonnet, for instance, scores better on affability or friendliness and tone than does the 4.0. Or you might find that 4.0 is just better at handling some of these more edge case based scenarios just by virtue of its training than does another LLM. So, you that's what we mean by pairwise comparisons. And these, once you set up an evaluation framework, you can compare different LLMs and how they perform as well. So on to the next slide. So I talked about this earlier. How do we think about targeted quality tuning? And again, we're bringing together some of the stuff we've talked about here, but the goal is, can we enhance the model's reliability? Can we enhance its safety and make it perform well, no matter what scenario it is? And the other goal, which I didn't explicitly mention yet, was obviously to reduce hallucinations, right? Like, it shouldn't feign um, confidence when it is saying something incorrect, because that may not work depending on your industry scenario. uh, and you want to avoid these critical domain errors. For instance, if it's a banking-based LLM and someone just says, transfer me money, like, that is a scenario that you want to make sure you account for as part of your evals framework. Define that in the ground truth as, here's, like, here's potentially how you would want to respond to it, or that this is like a bad response. And you also want to, of course, have that trustworthy label attached to your agentic or LLM based workflow. And again, all of this investment, thinking about this upfront, it will directly translate to higher quality and actionable LLM outputs. Because again, you might see this as a lagging indicator that the adoption of your product that you've deployed, or the chatbot that you've deployed, is very low despite it being highly accurate and everything. And this is a problem that many teams face. So maybe there's a deeper problem there, right? And our goal is, as much as possible, to get towards that higher quality response. Quality, of course, being the subjective definition for your specific context. So, in starting to wrap this all up, I'd say, if you're going to walk away with certain key takeaways, it should be that the traditional benchmarks are insufficient for these generative models. The evaluations must be context aware, and we need to think about multiple dimensions. And real world safety, as we start to make these a part of critical workflows, requires judgment, domain expertise, and of course, iteratively, by continuing to add to that ground truth, you need to keep making your models better. And holistic evaluations are definitely an important part of how we get there. So with that, I welcome any questions or thoughts. I'd love to hear about your own experiences working with some of this too. So I'll just stop sharing and get back to the Google Meet. I'll open the Q&A window. Okay. Okay, that's any questions or comments that you'd like to share? I know we're about to wrap this up.
There is some questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you already got to those.
Yeah, I just saw this question rolled in about yeah, what are the metrics for financial industry? So I don't have a lot of experience there, but again, I would just think about it. Again, putting my PM mind to work, I would think about what are some of the most important things within the financial industry. To me, the most important thing would be accuracy. And what I mean by that is just matching. For instance, if someone's asking about the balance in their bank account, you want to make sure that you're telling them the right balance for that person. Uh, or perhaps you choose to take the opinion that that is not information that will be exposed through the chatbot. That certain financial data the person should just see when they open the app themselves. And then going beyond that, again, it would be metrics around safety, right? Like I want you to deduct $500 from person X's account. You want to avoid those kinds of things. So again, it's hard to say what the metrics are, but you'd want to build an evaluation framework specifically for that industry based on some of those, you know, scenarios where how you would expect the domain experts to interact with those questions as well, because this is the thing that takes a it also took me a lot of time to absorb. This is like a non-deterministic thing, right? Unlike the systems that we've built typically, where there's a pretty clear understanding of what's working and what's not, when something is working and when it's not working. Here you could have multiple ways that it can go well. So yeah, I know that doesn't answer the question, but there is no fixed answer as such. Okay, I think we're at time too. So thank you all for joining. I'm glad you could all make it and partake in this as well. And hopefully you all come up with holistic evaluation frameworks within your work context as well. And thank you to the organizers, to Tina and to Faraz for organizing this session as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Rajat.
Yeah, thank you all.